Hello, I'm the Past Master and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to have a blast with the past and I'm going to tell you one of my favourite stories about one of history's most terrible tyrants. So this is the story of King John, or as I prefer to call him, Jealous John. That's an example of a very good book about King John if you want to learn more about his life. So I'm going to be telling you about a particular vicious vice that King John had and the effect that it had on him as a king, why it explains some of the terrible things that he did during his reign and the rotten reputation that he's got. So King John was a jealous man, and if you don't know what jealousy is, basically it's wanting things that other people have. So for me, a good example when I was about 5 was in the playground at my school. One of my friends had a novelty Halloween toy, and when you opened it up, it made a funny sound. And at the age of 5, I really wanted one of these for myself. But of course, I couldn't have it. Now, jealousy caused a lot of problems for kings over the ages. And particularly because when a king really wants something, they usually find a way to get it. So a good example of this was King David in the Bible stories. So King David really wanted to marry this beautiful woman, Bathsheba. The only problem was that she already had a husband, Uriah the Hittite. So King David conspired to send Uriah to the front at the battlefield and pretty much guarantee that he would get killed so that he could have his way with Bathsheba, so that he could marry her. Now, King John suffered from a similar kind of jealousy. He, in fact, really wanted to marry a French heiress, a beautiful, virtuous, no doubt, young woman called Isabel of Angoulême. And he was prepared to overcome obstacles using his kingly power to get her. Obstacles that included, we would have said, her young age. She was about 11 at the time. Obstacles that included the fact that he already had a wife, Isabel of Lincoln, whom he had set aside by the Pope. And obstacles that included the fact that Isabel of Angoulême was already engaged to be married to another man, Hugh le Brun, Count of Lusignan. So King John was determined to have her, and in the year 1200 he succeeded in obtaining her. But he won a wife and started a war, not just with Hugh le Brun, but also with the French king Philip Augustus. In the end, his quarrels with Philip Augustus resulted in the defeat of John's allies at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, and the loss for John of most of his lands in France. So this was a disaster for the English king, which you would probably agree was far greater than the gain of the wife. So he won a wife, but in the end he lost the war. Now, King John is also known for his jealousy of other people's cash. He wanted loads of money, and he wasn't that particular about how he got it. The most famous stories about John getting his hands on people's cash are the Robin Hood stories. However, these are actually from a time when John was not king. He was regent, ruling for his brother, King Richard the Lionheart, who was off fighting in the Holy Land on crusade. So Richard the Lionheart was wading into the sea and fighting against Saladin, and John was picking up the bills. In fact, he ended up paying a king's ransom to get Richard out of prison. You might say that that was a noble way to spend the money. However, the Robin Hood stories show us that people at the time felt that Prince John and later King John was extorting their money through evil councillors like the Sheriff of Nottingham and using it for his own gain. Now, the problems of King John with money were particularly clear later on when he was in fact king in his own right. In 1215, a group of powerful noblemen who rebelled against King John, along with their supporters like London merchants, insisted that King John restrict what he could take from people, that new taxes could only be raised with the agreement of a council of great men, that unpopular subordinates, minions if you like the kinsman of Gerard Dathy, should be fired, and that King John would keep his greasy fingers away from the justice system and from the inheritance of heirs. So the sons of wealthy men, the daughters maybe of wealthy men, when these people died before those inheritors were old enough, they would not in fact inherit for a few years until they came of age. And in this period, John had been used to taking advantage of their inheritance to make money for himself and his friends, and he had to promise not to do that anymore. So people were pretty angry about the way in which he used their money, he abused his power. In fact, the barons were also pretty concerned. In some cases, they made accusations anyway that John was interested in their wives and daughters too. So it's clear that his reputation from marrying Isabel of Angoulême in 1200 had not left him in 1215. Now, King John's most troublesome jealousy was really not of money or of someone else's wife. It was a kind of paranoia, a fear, a jealousy of other people's power. Perhaps this started with his brother Richard wanting his brother's throne. King John was the youngest of 4 sons who became adults, and he clearly had ambitions which he might never have fulfilled. But he also was very suspicious of successful noblemen. For example, William de Roche, who helped him to defeat the French at Mirabeau in 1202, who helped him to seize his nephew, John's nephew, Arthur, who was a challenger for the throne of England. You might think that William de Roche would be rewarded as a loyal subject of King John, but no, John ignored him, suspected him, cold-shouldered him, and took control of Arthur for himself. The case of Arthur is perhaps the worst case of King John's jealousy of other people, because Arthur was locked away, no doubt in some horrible house arrest or dungeon, and then it is said that in a fit of drunken, jealous rage, John murdered Arthur and threw his body into the river. Now, this story may be the story of scurrilous gossip mongers, as W.L. Warren describes it in his book, but mud sticks, and Arthur certainly disappeared from the scene. King John's desire for power extended beyond what he could reasonably achieve and threatened the future of his dynasty. So he drove away one of his most loyal supporters, William Marshal the Elder, who ended up, luckily perhaps for John and for his family, coming back to run England when John's son had taken over after John's death in 1216, and as the regent of England. Now also King John picked a fight with one of the most powerful men in Europe. He'd already picked a fight with Philip Augustus, the King of France, but he also picked a fight with the Pope. Now the Pope was in charge of the church, as he is in charge of the Catholic Church today. The Pope was determined that his candidate should become Archbishop of Canterbury, and the king refused to accept Stephen Langton. They fought for about 8 years over this. The king was excommunicated, the priests of England went on strike, and the king in return seized the wealth of various monasteries, upset a lot of the monks, people who were literate, they wrote, they could read and write, and they were the people who in fact would write his story. Roger of Wendover, for example, in his Flores Historiarum, a Latin title, makes an example of John as a terrible king who met a bad end. So all this jealousy did lead to a pretty bad end for John. By the end of 1214, he had lost most of his land in France, apart from an area called Gascony. By the end of 1215, he was on the run after the failure of Magna Carta to reconcile, to bring back together King John and his powerful noblemen. And then in 1216, a series of personal catastrophes. So for a man who liked his money, it is said that King John lost his crown jewels running away from his enemies, crossing the Wash in Lincolnshire. Then it is said that King John was taken away after perhaps eating too many peaches, that's what some of the stories say, in a violent storm in October 1216. The implication is that the devil took one of his own. Now, perhaps King John was poisoned. That's another suggestion. Certainly his death came at the right time for his family, because William Marshal took over, and Marshal, working for the young King Henry III, was able to defeat the French invaders who had come to claim the throne for Philip Augustus's son, and thus save the English royal family. But it was a pretty disastrous end to a rather disappointing reign, and one of history's most terrible tyrants had written his way into our storybooks and into Shakespeare's histories. So that's all from me for today, but please do continue watching my videos, and I will be talking about another terrible tyrant tomorrow, and you will be able then to judge for yourself which was worse, Jealous John or Hungry Harry.